I moved in and out of my dad's house for years, trying to find some sort of stability to grasp onto. He's clean and very set in routine, so living with him is predictable and makes me feel more grounded. Although things became more stable at home, I was struggling internally. I was still self-harming at this point and attempted to take my own life. I remember fading in and out in the ambulance in the emergency room and waking up to my dad sobbing as incredible guilt washed over me. I spent another few weeks in the hospital and returned to my dad's for another 6 months. I moved back in with my mom and grandfather when I turned 16. I was still missing school regularly and failing most of my classes because I simply couldn't focus on anything but what I was going home to. There were days where my mom would just disappear and not answer her phone. Days where she would try to kick me out of the house when she would get really high and try to scream at me or pin me up against the wall because she drank over a fifth of vodka by herself mixed with Klonopin. Days when I would wake up and nearly $200 of my savings I slept with in my pillow had mysteriously disappeared while I was sleeping. I had started to feel incredibly disgusted with my body and out of control in my life, so I started to do research on extreme diets, skip meals, and count my caloric intake. It quickly grew into an obsession. I was constantly researching new ways to speed up my metabolism, pills I could take to help me lose more weight, pro-anorexia tips, and Thinspiration. All I could do was focus on how my weight had changed, how to lose more, how disgusting I felt, and how my mom and family didn't seem to notice I was wasting away. My mom was nodding out all the time and blacking out. Once my doctors began to notice my weight loss and health declining, they diagnosed me with severe anorexia. I had lost over half my body weight and was purging upwards of 9 times a day on top of the restriction and laxative/diet pill abuse. I could feel death creeping in on every inch of my body, slowly eating me away, and I didn't care that I was going to die. My mom was particularly triggering for me. There would be full conversations at the top of her lungs about how there wasn't any point in buying me food because I was just going to purge it. We fought with the insurance for 8 months before my family had to scrape up the money for me to be admitted into an inpatient eating disorder treatment facility in Wickenburg. I spent 45 of the most difficult and life-changing days of my life there and truly learned who I was. I was a shell of a person who internalized far too much, was hell-bent for slow suicide, and completely submerged in a deep-rooted self-hatred. I utilized my program on a daily basis at this time, not only in an Alateen format, but also in a 12-step-based recovery. I learned to forgive my mom in some aspects and to healthfully distance myself so I can still take care of myself and make decisions based upon what I need, not what makes her comfortable. When I returned home, it was like I had to learn to do everything all over, and I was seeing everything clearly for the first time. I chose life every single day from that point on, despite the hell I was going through internally. I was constantly nauseated and physically unable to keep my food down nearly every single day on and off. I dismiss this as normal motility issues that comes with recovery but fades away with abstinence, only to find out nearly 3 years later that my eating disorder caused permanent paralysis of my stomach and small intestine. My recovery was incredibly difficult at first. I couldn't eat in public without fearing the entire restaurant would be staring at me, thinking I was eating too much, too fast, or too high calorically. 2.5 years ago, I fell in love with an alcoholic. I was so vulnerable and afraid of everything at that point in my life. I had begun to message an old friend from program that I had always had feelings for. He was the first person to even notice my eating disorder. He really cared about what I had to say when we talked, and was very body positive for me. He would tell me I was beautiful all the time, compliment my curves, feed me as often as possible, which meant he would split every snack he ate with me, make me breakfast, take me out to lunch and dinner frequently. He would get me out of my house when things were just too much, which pretty much meant all weekend, pretty much every weekend. He brought out some of the best parts of me, sides of me I didn't even know existed. Who he was and what he strongly believed in pushed me to constantly challenge my limits and be the most confident self I could be. When we started our relationship, I thought the amount of drinking he did was normal. I even tried to drink sometimes because I felt so excluded being sober. I quickly learned that I didn't like alcohol, and neither did my body. I would just cry when we would go out, and everyone, including him, would fall asleep. I would look at him sleeping and feel his chest rising against mine. Every time, I would worry that it would be too much for his body or his mind that time, and that his chest would stop rising. We would go to parties frequently. I would typically go to try and spend time with him and make sure he was okay when he was drinking. I can't tell you how many times he would just walk off into the party without me in places where I didn't know anyone. I can't drive, so I couldn't take myself home when I would get uncomfortable, which also meant me rode in the car with drunk people pretty often. He wouldn't drive when he was intoxicated because he'd been in a drunk driving incident before that, and it appeared to have turned his life upside down for a while. I think he had a court order to attend AA meetings, and he said that at one point he had considered himself an alcoholic. I could never get him to admit he was still struggling because he would mostly just drink on the weekends, but the way he would drink was to such a dangerous excess. He would change as a person when he got drunk. We had some good moments when he was drunk, but the moments where I didn't recognize him anymore became overwhelmingly prominent. One night we had gone over to hang out with my friend and her boyfriend. She was going to drink with him, but had work the next day, so he ended up drinking on his own. He nearly finished an entire fifth of vodka by himself that night. He just seemed to crawl inside of himself. We fell asleep eventually, and I woke up to him gagging and coughing on his back. I went into complete panic mode and flipped him over on his side so he wouldn't keep throwing up and breathing it in. While that night could have ended worse, it still frightens me to my core. At that point, I knew things were not okay. I thought that I couldn't leave him alone when he drank after that. As my worries and disgust for alcohol grew, the harder it became to pretend things were all right when we went out. Tension began to build and put a large gap between us, because I would try so hard to keep him home and do something other than go somewhere where there would be alcohol. His drinking became every weekend, for every occasion, regardless of what obligations were that day or tomorrow. He would go out without me because I started to speak up about how his drinking scared me and bothered me. He didn't become completely careless, but I began to see this change brew inside of him. He stopped opening up to me and inviting me places. We began to fight regularly, and I felt this space growing between us. He pushed me away harder than anyone in my life has ever before. Within a few weeks of the fighting starting, he began to avoid my texts and canceling our visits. I went to meetings during this period of time and called my sponsor regularly. I was trying so hard to be there for him, to make it work, but the drinking always started arguments that were dismissed and never discussed once it broke the surface. The next thing I knew, we were standing in front of my house, crying and hugging, because we both knew we came to an impasse and had to break up. He wasn't going to give up drinking and wasn't ready to support anyone but himself, and I wasn't going to tag along anymore. I cried myself to sleep for months, worrying about him, just wanting to talk to him and understand why he pushed me away after a year and a half together. My best friend had just overdosed on heroin, trying it for her first time around then. Somehow she survived that and the years of pills, booze, bath salts, and meth she put herself through. We'd always had each other, even through the worst, but I had to separate myself from her. She would use me to get out so she could get high or go be with her abusive boyfriend. I can't tell you how many times she ran away on a binge and ended up at my house by the time she ran out of fuel. Eventually, she stopped coming by and contacting me. They were both being torn away from me when I needed them the most. I had to force myself to work my program harder than I ever had before. It was the only way to get through some days, and it still can be. I still struggle to this day because I want more than anything to stop him right now before he has to suffer. But I know that it's a choice he has to make. I can't force him to get better. I can't expect him to get better for me. I just have to let it go and try to just be for that moment so I can get through. I just needed to let him know that I will always be there to pick up the phone if he calls. I'll always be there if he stops, and I will always have a place for him in my heart. The wound is still as raw today as it was when I was watching my relationships fall apart. My dad now is 13 years sober, a stable job, his own house, and we have a wonderful relationship. My mom nearly has a month sober. To this day, my ex is still actively drinking. I'm not sure how much, but I can't allow myself to dwell on these things. My best friend has 9 months clean now, but I don't see her much. With the exception of my father, it still hurts me greatly to see them sometimes, but it's becoming easier to have some sort of relationship with them. I see the people I love now, not the addict or alcoholic that takes them over. That's one of the many ways this program has blessed me. Regardless of if my qualifiers are still using, I can still love them without allowing my emotion to rule how I interact with them. In closing, I would like to share one last quote with you. You who have suffered, find where love hides. Give, share, lose, lest we die unbloomed.